Welcome again to our, is this our third? Yeah, this is our third Zoom History Happy Hour. First one in the museum. This is not one of those fancy Zoom backgrounds.
No, it's not.
We are actually here in Seminary Ridge Museum. We reopened, this is going to be our third weekend open, so we thought we'd come up here and do a program this evening.
We had a great day today, right?
We did have a great day.
Best day
Yeah.
since we reopened. So.
Yeah. It's hot. People want to be
People
inside.
want to be inside. We got a great thing to do.
So yeah. So the last two times that we had a meeting with you all, I'm sorry about like a meeting with you all. We were talking about the battle. We were talking about we spent a lot of time talking about June 30th and July 1st, and then last month we talked about the fighting that happens on Seminary Ridge. So this evening, we want to take it inside and talk about specifically this building, a seminary building, as a hospital, but really take that beyond just this building and talk about some of the changes in medicine during the Civil War, in science and logistics, that really start to get at that old adage that this was the medical Middle Ages, that it was a medical disaster, doctors were butchers, all of those myths, and really try to think about them and talk about what was going on during the Civil War that challenges that.
Yeah, and it's an important thing to think about. And I've said this, I've said it once, I've said it 1,000 times. The Civil War really becomes, we think about the major social and cultural impact of the Civil War, the end of slavery, the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, these massive changes in social and cultural life in the United States that we still struggle with, that we're continuing to struggle with it as of right this minute. We generally think of those, but we don't sometimes stop and think about the structural changes in the ways that people looked at things that we could roughly say are economic. Supply chains and the networks and the railroads, and creating the kinds of infrastructures that are going to lead to and lay the foundation for the Second American Industrial Revolution. So a lot of the knowledge that comes out of the war experience and the hospital experience, the Ordnance and Quartermaster Bureau's experience, and this is in the North and in the South. And you have, after the Civil War, a lot of these men who are leaders of the Confederate Ordnance and Quartermaster Supply Bureaus go into business. They end up being very, very successful as cotton brokers and industrialists in the South after the war is over. So it's not just in the South or not just in the North that you're seeing these big changes take place. And it really fundamentally shifts the way that people think about organizing people and organizing stuff. And that's a massive undertaking. These armies during the Civil War are the largest organizations that have ever been created on the North American continent, at least from the point of colonization in the 17th century in British North America, and certainly in the European descended people's experience. This is the African American people. This is the most massive scale of people doing things together that has ever happened, and making it function. And they have no idea. Well, it's an overstatement to say they have no idea what they're doing at the beginning of the war. But they started from a base of knowledge that was totally inappropriate. Is the wrong word, but it's one I want to use. Inappropriate for the tour that's
unprepared. Is unprepared the right word?
Unprepared is kind of, I was listening to Dr. Fauci this afternoon talking about the structures of public health and the ways that this challenge that we have with coronavirus is making everyone rethink how public health works. Because some of the tried and true tactics of public health aren't working very well with this.
Well, and I've long wondered, long meaning 3 months, 4 months now.
Seems long. It seems insanely long.
What changes are going to come out of this? Because think about meeting a challenge, and that's exactly what the Civil War is when you think about medicine and logistics, it's all of that, and what changes are coming out of that challenge, and then how does it get broadcast beyond that?
There are questions that nobody imagined to think in 1860 that had to be answered by 1862.
Yeah.
That people had to come up with solutions for, and on a in a very different context. This is what we're dealing with right now. So I heard Fauci was talking earlier on the radio. As I'm pulling in tonight to come in here, there's a story on NPR about how far is the most remote that you can work. The tagline was, we proved that we can work remotely, but how remote can you be?
I'm willing to undertake that challenge.
I'm going to test that.
But I think it's important to remember that. Let's go back to 1860 and think about. We can touch on the Confederate Army in a second, but let's just think about the United States, if you want.
We can talk a little bit.
But let's think about the United States Army.
This is the United States Army Hospital.
Right. 16,000 men, spread mostly among these Western outpost garrisons, and this is the structure that the Army had developed was to deal with that challenge, I guess, of having these garrisons all over, but only 16,000 men. Yeah. And they had the correct number of surgeons for that, but then the Battle of Bull Run is going to occur, and you're going to see this ramp up in enlistees in a very short period of time, and they end up at Bull Run, at the first Battle of Bull Run in July of 1861, and it is basically a disaster in terms of trying to evacuate wounded soldiers from the field, set up field hospitals. One of the people that I tend to look at and tend to spend a lot of time thinking about is this guy named W.W. Keane, and he is the person with whom I would most like to sit down and have a cup of coffee.
Really?
He is.
Oh,
yes.
Well,
because he's born in 1837 and dies in 1932, and he is very conscious of the fact of he writes a prolific writer later in life, and he writes about how much change he experienced in his life between being this young Civil War surgeon who shows up at Bull Run and says, "I was as green as the grass around me."
Let's think for just stop for just a second and think about scale. So on January 1st, 1861, there are 16,000 men in the United States Army. Mm-hmm. There are 30,000 men, give or take, in McDowell's army that engages the Confederates at First Bull Run.
Right.
And so that's unbelievable. I mean, that's just one field army.
Right. And then, fast forward to the Peninsula Campaign a year later, and you've got 100. What did he have? About 100,000.
112,000 in the U.S. Army, about 85,000, 90,000 in the Confederate Army.
So,
and those are just the Eastern armies. We're not even considering Johnston's army and Thomas and Sherman, and these guys are in Kentucky, and Grant, who's out in the western parts of Kentucky. And
it's unbelievable.
And it all happens in a 6-month stretch of time.
Yeah. So
not much more time than what we have done with this pandemic that we're looking at right now. So that's some scale.
Yeah.
We just passed 4 months, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Bull Run is a disaster from a medical standpoint. Doctors are not sure how to set up field hospitals. Men are for days out on the field, wounded, without water, medical care. The ambulance system is almost non-existent. Whatever ambulances they were almost at the head of the line during the retreat. And as you could imagine, there is a lot of anger and frustration and outcry over this. And as Darrell was pointing out, the Army is even getting bigger beyond the first Battle of Bull Run, and it's recognized by early 1862 that there's going to need to be a system that is put in place to manage this. Yeah. And I kind of look at it as two interrelated but different things that are happening during the the Civil War with regards to medicine. One is what I consider the field army sort of logistical thing, and it's getting men to getting them off the field to hospitals, figuring out how to treat them on the field, getting supplies, ambulances, medicines to the field. And then there's a sort of a separate, again, but interrelated, that's looking at science and creating scientific knowledge based on observations, treatments, studying specimens, studying the human body. And both of these things, both of these components are going to add dramatically to what Americans know about medicine when we get to 1865.
Yeah, and it's happening in the Confederate Army as well. And we don't know the story quite as clearly as we do for the United States Army, because there's not a publication on the scale of the medical and surgical history of the Civil War, or the War of the Rebellion, right?
Yeah.
There are documents that allow us to get a little bit of insight into it. It's something. It's a research field. Any graduate students out there, you might want to take a look into this, because one of the things that Emeritus Director Barbara Franco has learned since she retired 5 years ago, through a really detailed study of all of the surgeons at Gettysburg, both North and South, is that the surgeons from the Confederate Army were generally more highly educated at more prestigious medical schools than the average surgeon in the United States Army. They go to Paris, they go to Philadelphia and study at high-ranked medical schools. So they're from the planter class. Their socioeconomic backgrounds much they're more prominent. They're slave-holding families are sending their sons off to become medical doctors. So you do have some very talented medical professionals in the Confederate Army. The organization is very similar. They've inherited the same kinds of structures, and the way that they play them out is somewhat similar.
And there's a West Point, what I like to call the West Point effect, where you have people going to the same schools and then ending up on both sides. And so you have Confederate doctors that know Union doctors that went to school. There's 630 students at Jefferson Medical College in 1859, and I forget what the percentage is that go south and north, but some of them go south, some of them go north.
Yeah.
And so they had the same education going into it.
And when you start looking at the kinds of conversations that are going on, this is one of the things that I find fascinating about both the religious aspects of the Confederate Army and the medical side of both armies, is you have within those organizations sub-organizations that function almost like professional associations. You've got the Army of Northern Virginia had the 2nd and 3rd Corps Chaplains Association, founded partly by J. William Jones, but a very influential network of ministers who were working together during the war, and they continue to be friends and work together after the war is over in their own denominational context, but they still have these social ties that bind them together that predate the war, continue through the war, and are strengthened by the war, and then continue after the war. Same thing is going on with these medical doctors.
So there's a great article, I think it's in the Boston Medical Journal. Doctors from the 5th Corps get together after the Battle of Gettysburg and are discussing their cases. And it's not a formal organization; it's an informal gathering of these surgeons, and they nominate one of them to submit this report to the Boston Medical Journal. So it's really amazing that they can do something like that, and that they're having the foresight. And what this really is getting at is the construction of knowledge and the sharing of knowledge and the ability to draw conclusions based on a large sample. And going back to W.W. Keane, one of his real area of expertise becomes neurology and neurological diseases. And he goes to Turner's Lane Hospital in Philadelphia in 1863. He's an interesting figure because he has both the field experience he has experience setting up field hospital, treating men in the field, but then he also has this experience doing research in hospitals and contributing to scientific knowledge. He actually is also an agent for the museum, the Army Medical Museum, which we'll get to in a sec. Anyway, I could go on about it, but I
Well,
won't.
and there are other challenges too that are outside of the Battle of Gettysburg that these people are facing.
Well, let me finish the story.
You finish the story. No one talks about refugees and white soldiers.
So one of the things that they're able to do again is contribute and draw conclusions based on a large sample. And Keene contributes to this book on neurological diseases that comes out of Turner's Lane Hospital. In the introduction to the book, the authors Keene and Silas Weir Mitchell write, we would see something that we had never seen before in terms of a neurological disease. And then the next day we'd see it again, and then the next day we'd see it again. So they were able to put together this sample and then follow these men through their treatment and took, oh my God, copious amounts of handwritten notes.
Knowledge goes from being largely anecdotal to being systemic or systematic.
And then they share it, and then they publish a book that any doctor can get their hands on and learn from the fact that these men, the soldiers, have been stricken with these diseases or injuries.
Just thinking about the challenges, it's not just the military challenges that are purely military challenges that the medical officers in the United States Army are encountering. Is especially in the West, you see this much more than you see in the Army of the Potomac, but you see as the Union armies of the Army of the Tennessee, the Army of the Cumberland, the Army of Ohio, as they get deeper into Tennessee and Georgia and Mississippi, and they're coming to these places where enslaved people are self-emancipating and fleeing to the United States Army's camps. It's the closest they'd ever been. The line between freedom and slavery is moving farther and farther south. And the feeling is that if we can get to the Union lines, then we're free. And you have tens of thousands, and it really picks up in late 1863 and 1864 in the Chattanooga area, in Knoxville, Tennessee. Nashville had already become a very important place for enslaved people from Middle Tennessee to self-emancipate to. In the Mississippi River Valley, you're seeing this happening. And it's a disaster. The medical treatment that's afforded many of these refugees and in these large refugee camps, the medical care that's provided for the soldiers and the U.S. colored troops is really lacking, and it's a real medical disaster. And many self-emancipated people end up dying because they made the choice to self-emancipate. There's some good literature that's in the last 6-7 years. Jim Downs has a really great book about
Sick from Freedom.
It's a fascinating book. It's a tragic book, worth reading. But we're thinking about medicine, and then you've got civilian populations. One of the things that when you read, I read recently the Repairing the March of War, which was
March of Mars.
Mars, excuse me. It's a diary of a Virginia Confederate hospital steward who's a non-commissioned officer who assists, does a lot of the daily kind of medical work in the regiment. And in several cases, he writes in his diary how concerned. First off, they're having meetings all the time. The surgeons and the hospital stewards are having conversations, medical conversations. Some of the surgeons have medical libraries in their tents. So when they're in winter camp, they're studying and talking. And
in the United States Army, these books are part of the supply chain.
Right.
They're sending them, and they're making sure that these men are these surgeons are furnished with these. They're not buying. I'm sure they're buying some stuff themselves, but it's also being issued.
The chaplains are doing the same thing. It's very interesting professional development. But the important thing here is that Worsham, I believe, is the fellow's last name. I'm suddenly forgetting his full name. In any case, when they're camped around Orange Courthouse, Virginia, in 1862 and then again in 1863, the civilian population has no desire whatever to have any contact with anybody who is in the camps because of the smallpox epidemics that raged from 62 and then through this 1863 period. They're very concerned about communicable disease, so there's an impact on civilian populations as well that really kind of force the hand of that's a really ham-fisted way of putting it. It really forces these doctors and medical professionals to really think through what their assumptions were about disease and their assumptions about treatment, about organizing hospitals. You know, if you went to a hospital before the 1870s or 80s, it's because you're poor, you're indigent, medical care was home care. The doctor would come and then the family would nurse.
And I think it's important to back up half a step.
Go ahead.
Talk about that a little bit about antebellum medical care, because in the immediate years, the decade or so leading up to the Civil War, it's becoming more professionalized. But between the late 1820s, early 1830s, and let's say 1850, medical care was not good. Let's just put it that way. And then you can easily become a doctor by taking a class that you had paid for. There were no state licensing boards. There was no curriculum that you could know, professional association, and you would take some didactic lectures, and you would go and become a doctor, become a country doctor. And in the late 1840s, early 1850s, you start to see what becomes a professionalization of medicine, and then it hits the overdrive during the Civil War.
Yeah, and it's not that the 1820s and the 1830s, or what it is that the 1820s, the 1830s, and the 1840s are a unique period.
Yes, they are,
because it is following on the heels of some pretty sophisticated medical thinking and medical training in the late 18th and early 19th century. But it's this democratic upswelling.
The age of Jackson,
where you have this anybody can do anything kind of notion getting into American culture that, well, we don't need training, we don't need
read a couple of books,
read a couple of books, you'll be okay. And
so there are vestiges of that still as the Civil War is breaking out. And to go back to our friend Keene again, he enrolls in Jefferson Medical College in 1859. Jefferson Medical College is then, as it is today, one of the premier medical colleges in the United States. Philadelphia is the center of medical training in the United States.
Benjamin Rush and John Adams.
And so Keene enters, and his classes consist of 6 didactic lectures in 6 areas. So he's just sitting there and listening and taking notes, and then he gets advised to go and to sort of intern at a doctor's office, and he hooks up with this guy named John Brinton. We'll talk about Brinton in a second. But Keene says later on that if I had not interned with Brinton, I never would have studied a body. I never would have looked through a microscope. I never would have written a prescription. So it was sort of on these doctors to go above and beyond just sort of the basic training to learn about the practical notions and the practical tasks behind treating a human body.
And then you get out into the country. There's a good example. George Huntley from the 34th
Carolina
spot. There's a soldier who fights here on Seminary Ridge in the 34th North Carolina, Albert Scales Brigade. And his father was the country doctor in Rutherfordton, North Carolina. It's up on the edge of the mountains. It's an isolated place today. It's much more isolated in 1860 than it is now. But you have to really want to go to Rutherfordton even today to see the place. But in any case, Huntley's father was the town doctor. Was the doctor in Rutherfordton.
Let me see some degrees.
It has no formal education, whatever. and is prescribing medicines, and it's likely folk remedies and herbal remedies,
Which may
have been very good. I mean, we know that a lot of medical treatments and drugs are developed out of the natural environment. So, you know, it's we can kind of laugh and say, oh, this is kind of Beverly Hillbilly stuff, but you know, he was.
I like to think the jar with 3 X's.
And that's exactly what it is. George Huntley is constantly writing back to his father, asking for some triple X. I have no idea. He never says what's in the triple X.
We don't want to know what's in.
Evidently, it was a very somewhat effective medicine because George kept asking for it. So in any case, there's a lot of complexity, there's a lot of variety in medical treatment and thinking about medicine at the beginning of the Civil War. And I think that probably is the last time you see that kind of diversity in medical thinking in American history. You know, I think again, this is a watershed. You've got the professionalization, you've got this expansion of knowledge.
The United States government is now going to step in, and we're gonna fast forward.
Yeah, fast forward. That's what we.
So there are and now I'm gonna back up a bit. But you know, there are homeopaths, there are Thomsonians, there are all these hydropaths, all these different notions about the best way to practice medicine and what makes sense.
Let me interject something just for a second. My wife is a veterinarian, and you know, I'm a historian, so you know, I don't understand chemistry very well. I don't understand biology very well, and I always had a notion that the doctors always automatically had the right answer at the right time, and that it was scientific, and because it was scientific, it was absolute, and this is what you do, and A, B, C, D, E. And you're finished and everything's fine. But what I started learning is we talked about what she would do on a day-to-day basis. There's a whole lot of art in being a medical professional, in being in these diagnosing contexts, in being in the curative, thinking about the curative process. And remember, before the Civil War, this was pre-germ theory, so there's a lot of important stuff that's not known yet. But the point is that even today, medical doctors are going to debate treatment options and treatment paths. Things are going to change. Exactly. things are going to change, and you know, the treatments are typically going to improve. Excuse me. It was remarkable. My father was diagnosed with a very rare form of lymphoma back in 2004, and the long story short is that the only treatment for that form of lymphoma in 2004 was a very aggressive inpatient round of chemotherapy, recovery, inpatient chemotherapy. He went to Atlanta and stayed in Atlanta for almost 6 months. And when his blood counts came back up, he would go back in and have this other round. Then he had a stem cell, you know, really horrifying stuff that he went through. When the cancer recurred, they had a pill. And it was 2018, so, excuse me, 2017, when we had to think about this again. And by that point, the understanding of how the disease worked, understanding of how the disease could be treated and contained had changed from 6 months of hellish inpatient chemotherapy to a tablet. It was absolutely when we started talking about what the treatment options were. I was like, wait a minute, you're telling me that this has changed this much in 17 years, 16 years?
So
13 years. God, it's even faster.
Yeah. So we're going to move through the Civil War to this point where the United States government is going to start testing and not licensing, but commissioning, giving surgeons commissions, assistant surgeons commissions to the best doctors, the best surgeons, the ones that can accurately pass a test that the government and government doctors have designed and administered.
And that's kind of across the board. In all forms, there are all areas of the Civil War armies. The end of 1861 and the beginning of 1862, you start to see a pretty serious clampdown on incompetent officers, incompetent
Yeah,
surgeons,
yeah.
Chaplains who were just coming to the Army and getting their money and wasting time, which really does happen in the Confederate Army. So, you know, February, March of 1862, the Confederate Army, you see a bunch of officers being run out. So they have to go through these tests.
And March, April, spring of 1862 is when William Hammond becomes the Surgeon General of the United States.
So this is the point that I'm making is that this is that what you're talking about with Hammond is part of a much larger systemic change.
Yeah. Well, it's not going to be a 90-day war.
No, it's not, and it's going to be one that has to be centralized.
Yeah.
In both sides, you know, both the Confederate Army and the United States Army are very, very centralized organizations. The Confederate government is very centralized. So, but this is a big change. It's a big shift in 1860.
So Hammond becomes the Surgeon General, and he is one of these sort of new wave of doctors who believes in the scientific method and recognizes pretty early on that the Civil War is a unique opportunity to learn about the human body, and Hammond very quickly issues two critical circulars out to the armies in the field. One of which is that doctors are going to be instructed to write up cases. There's going to be forms that are sent out. There's going to be record keeping that's going to be put into place, and we're going to collect all of this information. And this information, these reports that are sent back to the United States government, form the basis of what today we know as and he even called it this. He knew what he was going to do with these reports, even in 1862. That they are going to be published into the medical and surgical history of the War of the Rebellion. And if you're looking for some interesting bedtime reading, the Mishwar, as we in the know will call it, is on Internet Archive. So it's all been digitized, and you can go and find this all online. The second thing that Hammond is going to do that's going to go in part and parcel with this is that he is going to instruct doctors, instruct surgeons to submit interesting specimens to a new Army Medical Museum. And this museum is going to be open to the public. One thing that we didn't really talk about yet is that there is a distrust of doctors and medical professionals. They're quacks, they're sawbones, they're going to do more harm than good. They are, you know, anytime that they're doing an autopsy on a dead body, they're doing it for fun. They're not really professionals. So Hammond realizes that in order to create this air of professionalism surrounding medical care, that this new Army Medical Museum is going to be open to the public, so anybody can come and see what's there on display, and doctors can come and research and use the specimens in the Army Medical Museum to learn about the human body. And if you've seen the movie Lincoln from about 8 years ago,
no, it's a long time.
there is a very quick. I was in New Jersey. There's a lot of water for those bridges.
Boy, don't want to run to that. I don't know. That was a pretty interesting run to town.
But if you watch the movie Lincoln, there's a very quick shot where people are in the Army Medical Museum because they have the leg of Dan Sickles. Sickles here at Gettysburg sends his leg to the Army Medical Museum, and it is there today. We have a picture with it.
Yeah. Quick note, and I wasn't looking on Instagram or something here.
What's an Instagram?
You're talking about the U.S. publications. There is, and you can get this on Internet Archives too, it's called the Confederate States Medical and Surgical Journal, 1864 and 65. It's the same kind of stuff that Hammond has the United States Army doing, but it includes, you know, it's some pretty gory stuff. And it also includes some really remarkably risky and advanced surgical techniques that are being developed in the Confederacy. And one of the reasons they say they're doing this, they've got to keep people in the Army.
And that's another thing that there's this altruistic thought that, we want to care for these men that have given their lives, given their bodies to the cause. But there's also this thinking that, hey, we need as many people, and it's more so, I think, in the South than in the North.
Yeah, most certainly in the South. I mean, by the end of the war, 85% of the males between 16 and 55 had been mobilized. So I mean, they had mobilized everybody, just about everybody that they could, or were willing to mobilize.
Mm-hmm.
It's I've lost my train of thought. It was a really great insight about not altruism. Anyway, keep talking.
You'll come back to it. Well, and so the Army Medical Museum still exists today. It's the National Museum of Health and Medicine, and one of my favorite teaching tools here in this museum is that we were able to borrow specimens from the Army Medical Museum, and we have them on display here at Seminary Ridge Museum. And when we borrowed these items, they sent with them the write-ups that doctors had done, which was really amazing, including we have a knee joint from a soldier from the 53rd North Carolina who's wounded on July 2nd, and it came with the write-up, and the soldier was wounded and brought down to Frederick, Maryland, and then died. And I suspect that the Union surgeons did an autopsy on him, because in this report it has the weight of his heart, his liver, his lungs. So they were using that to learn about the human body and practice techniques. So coming back here to Seminary Hospital, the building becomes a hospital on July 1st. It starts off as a field hospital for Union soldiers in the 1st Division of the 1st Corps. This is all done under the Letterman Plan. Jonathan Letterman, who's the medical director of the Army of the Potomac in 1862, puts into place a series of reforms to guide this kind of the area of what I referenced earlier as medical logistics, moving men off the field and making sure that they get the best treatment possible within a field hospital, and then making sure patients are stabilized before moving them to larger hospitals in larger cities like Philadelphia and Baltimore. So anyway, this building becomes a field hospital, and then sometime around the middle of July, administratively it turns into a general hospital, and by that it starts accepting soldiers from all different areas, all different Corps, Union Corps, and even Confederate soldiers who have been left behind. And even in this building, they're contributing to medical knowledge. We have a knee joint that was amputated, we believe, in this building from a soldier from the 13th Massachusetts, Michael O'Laughlin, sent off to Washington, D.C., to the Army Medical Museum. But one of the most interesting things that I've discovered over the years is this new experiment that is tried out during the Battle of Gettysburg, this new procedure called hermetic sealing, S-E-A-L-I-N-G. And it's a new treatment for chest wounds that has just been approved by the medical department. Actually, it's June 26th.
Really? Wow.
157 years ago. A surgeon named Benjamin Howard, young assistant surgeon, and you can find this in the records, asks for approval from the Surgeon General's office, and they write, for this new procedure, we're gonna pack the wound in the chest with gauze, we're gonna seal it up, and it's gonna be able to reinflate the lung, and the patient is going to breathe. And the response, he lays this out for the Surgeon General's office. And the response he gets is, yes, and try this out during the Battle of Gettysburg. And the story goes that there are soldiers from the 5th Corps, a soldier named Alexander Ross, who gets one of these wounds in his chest, and the first surgeons that care for him say that it's an honor. And by this time, they're practicing triage. So if you have a chest wound, if you have a gut wound, if you have a head wound, you're going to be passed over until and made comfortable, and we're going to care for wounds that we can treat. Well, Benjamin Howard comes along and realizes that this is the perfect way to test his new treatment. And Alexander Ross lives only for 6 days, but he would have perished almost immediately had they not performed this surgery on him. So right in this building, and he writes up this case and sends it to him. The reason we know about it is because he writes the case up and sends it off to Washington, D.C., and it ends up in the Mishwar, and you can go and find it today, Alexander Ross, 140th New York. So
we've not talked about the hospital stewards.
Yeah, go ahead.
That these are perhaps some of the most important
unspoken,
unsung individuals in both armies, because they're the fellows who are providing the front line every day, keeping the guy. This is where my head was a few minutes ago. Keeping the guys in the army, keeping them healthy. The surgeon's job, just like a soldier's job, is only 3 days out of
fighting,
3 days out of 3 months in combat.
And it's periods of relative tedium punctuated with this intense action, and then eventually back to tedium.
And so the greater part of the work that these surgeons and these hospital stewards and non-commissioned staff who are taking care of the day-to-day operations, they do sick call in the morning and evening. They sort out who is sick and who's not.
Who's really sick.
Who's really sick, and then they prescribe, and then they compound medicine. One of the requirements of being a hospital steward was that you had some pharmacological knowledge, and that's an area that's becoming professionalized in the 1850s. So I think 46 or 54, which is it?
I think it's 54, because I think the AMA is 46.
So in any case, this is the everyday work of keeping soldiers healthy, and keeping tamping down communicable diseases, and helping make the decisions about. We know this from Worsham's diary that the hospital stewards are right in the middle of determining whether a regiment needs to be quarantined or not during a smallpox outbreak. And by 1862, they had come up with pretty, and this is in Robert E. Lee's army, pretty standardized observational benchmarks for identifying outbreaks of smallpox. They're looking at the sores, they're trying to identify the sores, and then they are making very fast decisions about quarantine, because they don't want this disease spreading through the Western camps. So these guys are all jammed in close together. Believe it or not, diseases spread really fast if you don't take precautions when people are jammed really close together. Infectious viruses are really easy to transmit when you're close to each other and you're not being careful. And this is what these people are taking very, very, these non-commissioned officers are taking very, very seriously. Somebody presents at sick call. Oh, this looks like the pustules. Let's bring the surgeon in. The surgeon comes into the case, makes a determination, and in a couple of cases that Worsham writes about in his diary, it's not even 12 hours before a regiment is not just. In one case, the one that he details the most, he says that the regiment is taken and put away from the brigade in a separate camp, and then the company in which the man was serving is then segregated from the rest of the regiment, and then eventually 2 or 3 individuals are segregated even farther and isolated. And he said it was the most pitiful thing that he ever saw, because one of the men and he said that they had to stay within a circle of like 20 feet, and nobody could come within 20 feet of them. And so what would happen is that the cooked rations would be taken up to the line, put down, then walk away, and the guy could come and get his
It's like when I drop my cat off in the vet.
Yes, exactly. And he said the most pathetic thing about this one guy is that he was isolated. He couldn't talk to anybody, and he didn't know how to read.
Ooh.
And so he just sat in that circle by himself for a couple of 3 weeks until they lifted the quarantine. So, but yeah, these the hospital stewards are the frontline guys. They're the ones who are, and they're also the ones who are in charge of maintaining the cleanliness and healthfulness of the hospital facilities themselves. And there is a fantastic book, I think it's on Internet Archive.
Oh yeah, Hospital Stewards
The
Manual.
Hospital Stewards Manual. It's revised in 1862 and 63. I think the revised version comes out in 1863. And it is a fascinating look at how a Civil War hospital is to be organized, including considerations for the number of cots that could be in a certain space based on the cubic feet and the capacity to ventilate and to circulate air.
Yeah, the prevailing theory in the mid-19th century at this point is that disease is spread through bad smells. This is what is predating germ theory. So hospitals were very clean, because if they're clean, they smell good. And I think it's Walt Whitman talks about walking into a hospital and he never smelled anything like it before. And that's because it's so clean. Now we can use the same instruments and the same fingers to probe different soldiers. I don't care about that yet, but so.
Well, they understand that transmission is going on through the air. They don't know what the agent of that communication
and that there's germ. This is
it's pre-germ theory, so they don't get that, but they understand that you've got to have the air move. And so you had to have a certain number of cubic feet for every single cot, and the cots had to be a certain distance from each other. There was there's like 3 or 4 pages on how to sweep the floors and how to use the bromine to disinfect the floors and all of the surfaces. And the timing of all of this is prescribed, and all of the organization of the hospital is described in this book. It really is a fascinating look, and it's really, we could make the argument that it's the origins of the modern American hospital system. The military hospitals themselves become the foundation for what become research and healing hospitals rather than places for indigent people who don't have somebody to care for them and attend to them. So, these are the first steps in the direction of institutionalizing the hospital in a way that moves it into a more generally accepted institution in American life, and one that's not wrapped up with race and class identity. Though they are, I mean, they're going to be segregated. The resources from late 19th, early 20th century black hospitals versus white hospitals is vast as you could imagine. It's not just schools that are segregated in buses and trains and trolley cars. It's hospitals and everything. So, and the level of treatment is in these African American hospitals is significantly less effective.
We're at 5:50.
Oh wow!
So I don't know, we
get cranked up on this one,
and
every time this one gets just kind of rolling. And
I know we do have a couple of questions, so maybe we can take a step back, and Rob, if you want to go with the questions.
Yes, we have 3 really good questions. I'm going to start with the 2 that'll be probably the easiest and quickest to answer, and then one might take a little bit.
One curveball.
So, are there any African American medical personnel at Gettysburg after the battle?
No, not in the Army.
Yeah.
Now, what you would have seen in the Confederate Army, we know, you would have seen African American wagon drivers and perhaps attendants who were working with the surgeons in particular regiments. We know that at the big general hospitals in the Deep South, Chattanooga is the one that I know the most about. There's a big Confederate hospitals network up on the hill above the Tennessee River. And Clarence Moore wrote a really great book in about 1985 or 86 called On the Threshold of Freedom. And he really goes into some great detail about the work that was being done by enslaved men as nurses in the big general hospitals. Nursing work for the Civil War is different than what we think of as nursing. The volunteer women who come into this building are functioning very much in that traditional caretaking, domestic type of treatment.
Writing letters,
Right.
feeding, and
Yeah, and in doing that kind of work. And it's very important work. And it's valuable work. But because of cultural issues and social restrictions, they're not the ones that are changing the sheets. They're not the ones who are turning the beds over.
never helping with surgery.
Yeah, they're not helping with surgeries, and I can't think of any examples of African American men assisting with surgeries or women, for that matter, assisting with surgeries in these big the big hospitals. So one of the things that we know very little about, but we know was very prevalent in the Confederate Army. There are a tremendous number of African American men who had been brought along as either personal servants for soldiers, and not just officers. You see in Lee's Army sergeants and corporals having enslaved people coming with them. It's indicative of how concentrated in the slaveholding districts the counties were from which Lee's Army drew its men. But we also know that there were a tremendous number of wagon drivers and laborers who accompanied the Confederate Army, and it's not that well documented. We get little glimpses
Anecdotal,
anecdotes and
Fremantle.
Fremantle sees these folks and describes them. But that is one of the things that we always have to be remembering. And if you were listening to with me when I was talking about Confederate arsenals, the vast majority of the men who worked at the Macon, Georgia Arsenal or the Macon, Georgia Armory were African American. Were either leased slaves or slaves owned by the Confederate Army. So a lot of the hard, heavy labor of running a big hospital in the big concentrated places was done by enslaved men.
Okay, thank you.
That wasn't as short of an answer as you were expecting, was it, Rob?
Well, they
No.
It's always more complicated than
It is.
this.
Okay, so the next one. We know about foreign-born commanders and observers part of both armies. Do we have foreign-born surgeons?
What was the
Do we have foreign-born surgeons? I probably.
Yeah.
The person to answer that would be
Barbara Franco, yeah.
Yeah.
And she knows every single
Every
one,
single surgeon.
she knows where they're from.
I would think that the 11th Corps would probably possibly have some recruiting heavily from immigrant communities, and that there could be. That's a great question. It's something I definitely want to look into, because I have not I've not even thought about that.
I hadn't either. I'm kind of running through my head trying to think about it.
Because and remember also that at this time, the real center of medical knowledge in the world is Europe. Your
Berlin and Paris.
Paris, Vienna. If you are going to be a medical doctor, that's where you really want to go. And even Keene, after he leaves the army in 1864, goes to Europe and spends time in Vienna and Paris and Berlin learning about honing his skills. So that's a great. Rob, make sure to
let's go
write down who asked that question. I want to get back to.
Yeah, we'll get with Barbara and find out that.
Absolutely, that came in by email, so that'll be easy.
We certainly know that some of the Confederate surgeons studied in Paris, and certainly some of the Union doctors that studied over there. So.
All right. Well, the next question. Let me find it. So, since the discussion began with logistics, are there logistical lessons the commanders took away from Gettysburg beyond the medical?
Beyond the medical.
They're always learning logistical process. I would argue that by the Gettysburg campaign, the logistics issues had pretty much been settled.
Mm-hmm.
Organizing, they knew how much fodder they needed for an animal. They knew. Well, let's think of Lee's army, and the example of Dorsey Pender's division. they're up in Buchanan Valley the night before the battle, and they're being issued clothes out of the wagons that had come up from Richmond. And they had developed, Lee had developed a forward supply base at Stevenson Depot down in the valley, just south of the Maryland state line. And so they were accumulating stocks and supplies at forward bases to be sent forward to the Army so that there wouldn't be as much of a demand on the horses. You can think a little bit later, and this is getting a field of what happened in Gettysburg, but when you start looking at the United States Army's efforts to resupply Rosecrans's army after the Battle of Chickamauga, which would eventually include the 11th and 12th Corps, but the efforts that were made to keep that army from starving and keep that army from running out of supplies when it was pinned down there in Chattanooga for a month and a half, shows a very sophisticated capacity to think about, multiple ways of delivering supplies, a very acute sensitivity to supply lines. Cracker Line is a good example of that, or is the perfect example of that. Thinking about how to connect river transportation, rail transportation, and horse-drawn wagons to supply. It's pretty sophisticated by the summer and fall of 1863.
And one of the big things to remember when thinking about logistics at the Battle of Gettysburg is there was one rail line.
Yeah.
One rail line. And not only that, but it had been really beat up by Elijah White's cavalry as they ride from Gettysburg to Hanover Junction just before the battle, burning up almost every railroad, every bridge that they could find. And the hero of that is Herman Howard, who comes along, had lived in Gettysburg, had been a professor at Gettysburg College, Pennsylvania College, and is able to rebuild the Gettysburg, Hanover, and Hanover Junction Railroad very quickly. And by July 7th, the Union Army is beginning to evacuate wounded soldiers. And one of the greatest, most amazing statistics I've ever seen about the Battle of Gettysburg, and it's one that does not get enough credit, is that the United States Army is able to evacuate 11,000 soldiers in 3 weeks, 2 weeks, between the 7th and the 21st of July, over one rail line.
Yeah.
And they have established a timetable, bringing supplies in on trains and then bringing soldiers out on those same trains. They have areas along the way where they stop and make sure that the soldiers get food and water on their way to Hanover Junction, and then are evacuating soldiers out to Baltimore and Philadelphia to care. And they know, as it's written in some of these, in the reminiscences of Jonathan Letterman, that they should not be moving, and they will not move soldiers until they've recovered enough to build up their strength to move out on a rail line. So that's where you get Camp Letterman.
Yeah, there's another story of evacuating the wounded that suggests how well the logistics branches of both armies had been developed. Okay, Robert E. Lee rides down the little farm lane behind the seminary, down to his tent on the Thompson farm around midnight, July 3rd.
Oh, yeah.
He meets John M. Bowdoin, whose cavalry brigade has just arrived. They meet overnight, and Lee outlines exactly how he wants to have the wounded men from the field hospitals gathered in wagons and then transported to Williamsport. By noon the next day, and Bowdoin has organized the wagon train that carries a large number of Confederate, 17-mile long wagon train of wounded men. And it's all organized and put in motion within 12 hours.
And is there
the next morning. And just, in Lee's order in Bowdoin was go as fast as you can, don't stop until you get to Williamsport. Which
follows, except for getting in a little scrap of Cunningham's Crossroads, they follow to the letter.
Yeah. So, and so thinking about marching orders, thinking about the order of the transportation, where the different wheeled vehicles are going to travel, how much, you got to be
With
thinking.
roadways, yeah.
And that's, logistics limit the campaigns. If you look at a Hollywood movie from the 60s, you would think that you could load a Civil War wagon up, 5 feet high above the walls of the wagon with ammunition. That's not the case. When you look at the way that with a regulation packing of ammunition into an army wagon, you wouldn't even have seen the ammunition boxes. You could do, if you were on flat ground, you could do 2 layers of boxes in a wagon, which again begs the question, well, how deep is the creek that you can go through to keep that ammunition dry? Well, the only navigable creek, or the only passable creek, is going to be one that doesn't get water up into the bed of the truck or in the bed of the wagon. So, they have thought this through incredibly well from a very high level. We were talking last week a couple of weeks ago about the Confederate Army's peak of supply perfection during the Gettysburg campaign. They were building a large armory. They'd already built a huge gunpowder facility, multiple arsenals across the South, and they had very efficient, very effective ways of organizing this. You look at the logistics, and again, I'm going to take a Western example because there's not one that I can think of from an Eastern battle, but there are ordnance wagons that are attached to Benjamin Cheatham's division during the Battle of Chickamauga, that as the battle is ending, you've got these guys out scouring the battlefield, picking up supplies and picking up material from the ground, including lead bullets, putting on the wagons and taking them back to Atlanta. They'd also developed a system of flags. Remember that, I don't know, on the Confederate side especially, you have a variety of calibers of weapons being used, and if you go to the wrong wagon, you're going to find ammunition that doesn't fit your gun. And Cheatham's division had developed, and probably all of the Army of Tennessee had developed a system of flags that would tell the troops where the wagons from particular brigades were. So you could go to the right wagon train. The United States Army, by and large,
58
by this time of the war,
5.77.
58 caliber is going to be the same size as 5.77, and any wagon you draw from.
Right.
Although, of course, they're going to have to account for all this because all of these, it's all government property.
Yeah. That's what a ward master's doing in the hospital.
And that's what a ward master did at a hospital. It's what the quartermaster sergeants and quartermaster officers at the brigade and the regimental level, they have to be bonded. One of the most interesting diaries I ever read was one written by the quartermaster sergeant from the 48th Tennessee, and he writes this is a long passage about how difficult it was to get a bond so he could become someone responsible for government property. So they're thinking these things through, but I would say that they're reaching the peak at Gettysburg, and then they had a lot of experience by then. Right. Water, rail, and horse-borne traffic or transportation. So,
anything else, Rob?
No, I don't believe so. That's all we've gotten in right now. Does anybody have any comments, any questions, or want to have anything they'd like to say? If you do, please unmute yourself.
Well, I have something I'd like to say.
I'm sure.
Just talk a little bit about what we have going on for the next week.
Yeah.
Tuesday afternoon at 2 p.m., Daryl and I are going to be up in the cupola talking about the eve of battle, what's going on in and around Gettysburg as Buford's cavalry comes in and sees Pettigrew's troops and how that influences what Buford is going to do on the evening of the 30th into the morning of the 1st. And then on the morning, throughout the day on July 1st, we're going to have special Facebook Lives from the grounds around the seminary, talking about the fighting that's going on here, this building becoming a field hospital, Even preceding that, as we go through the next couple of days, we have a new series called Beyond the Ridge, where we've gone out and visited some of these interesting sites that tend to be overlooked in the Gettysburg campaign, but are nonetheless important. We posted the first one today. I was out at the Caledonia Iron Works, which was burned on this day 157 years ago by Jubal Early's troops.
Who were right here in Gettysburg.
Right here in Gettysburg at this time.
At this time, getting ready to go into camp just around Rock Creek.
So that is all, everything is going to be on our Facebook page. So you can check that out. And that's what we have going on. We'll be back next month. We'll have to figure out what we're going to talk about next month. We're running out of stuff to talk about.
Just say y'all talk.
Yeah. Here,
say something.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll give you a topic. Discuss.
I was reading a diary recently, and she was talking about, actually it was a letter to somebody, that she was saying that all the volunteer nurses that were coming to Gettysburg, all they did is run around at night in town.
I've never heard that.
I've not heard that.
I have to go back and try to find it, but I do know it was in Gettysburg, and that she was very upset because all these young women who were not local were running around town at night.
Oh yeah. Help me with the name. Why am I having such trouble with names all of a sudden? Peter Tinsley from the 23rd Virginia, one of Pickett's regiments, talks about seeing how horrified he was by the behavior of these she-doctors as they gallivanted around the battlefield and lifting their skirts as they stepped over wounded men, and the she-doctors from Chambersburg who had the audacity to tell men what to do. Tinsley's a very interesting character. Yeah, about that might be a good topic for next time, talking about the volunteer nurses here in the building. There's some really interesting stories there.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us. We'll see you all again next month. Have a great weekend. Have a great 4th of July. And
we're open.
We're open, yeah.
Starting on the 1st and all the way through
Following Monday, your birthday.
my birthday, yeah.
All right. Take care, everyone.
See y'all.
Thank you.